There was a moment when people believed they finally saw light at the end of the tunnel. But as that light grew brighter, something far more disturbing began to take shape behind it. For a brief period of time, hope seemed possible. Not loud or triumphant, but quiet and cautious. The kind of hope that appears only after prolonged darkness, when exhaustion lowers the guard of disbelief. Something shifted. A figure once considered untouchable was quietly summoned for questioning. A structure believed to be solid began to show hairline fractures. From a distance, it looked like progress. Yet history teaches us to be careful with early light. Because illumination does not always reveal salvation. Sometimes it reveals scale. As the darkness receded, what emerged was not a single wrongdoing, nor a solitary villain. It was a network. Vast, layered, and designed to operate without ever announcing its presence. No official names, no signed orders. Just a system that functioned flawlessly because everyone inside it understood the rules without being told. At the center of this story stands a man who never sought conflict. An artist by nature, a performer by calling. Someone whose ambitions were modest, almost naive, in a world that rewards calculation over sincerity. He wanted to sing, to act, to exist within his craft without bending himself into shapes he did not recognize. That, it seems, was his first mistake. In an industry built on visibility, he began to disappear. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Opportunities became conditional. Conversations grew vague. Contracts arrived carrying promises that felt generous, even redemptive. But beneath the surface, they were binding. Quietly restrictive. Designed not to elevate, but to contain. We have seen this pattern before. When a system does not attack directly, it surrounds. When it does not silence outright, it isolates. The absence of resistance becomes indistinguishable from consent. Around him were familiar faces. People he once trusted. Former classmates. Old colleagues. Their presence offered reassurance at first. Familiarity feels safe when uncertainty takes hold. But safety can be an illusion, especially when loyalty is no longer personal, but structural. He was not warned. He was not threatened. There were no raised voices or explicit ultimatums. Only expectations. Unspoken but unmistakable. The kind that do not require enforcement because the consequences are already understood. At night he struggled to sleep. During the day he searched for meaning in small rituals. He once spoke of mornings when sunlight touched his face and reminded him that most things, in the end, did not matter as much as they seemed. Those moments mattered because they gave him strength. Just enough to keep going. What he did not know then was how narrow his path had become. Because the closer he moved toward independence, the more precise the boundaries around him grew. Every step forward was measured. Every decision observed. Not by a single authority, but by a mechanism that didn't need to identify itself to be effective. And that was when he realized something unsettling. Freedom was not being denied to him. It was being redirected. And the closer he came to freedom, the more tightly the walls began to close in. Systems like this rarely announce themselves. They do not need to. Their greatest strength lies in their ability to feel inevitable, like gravity. You do not see them working, yet everything bends in their direction. At first glance, the structure surrounding him appeared ordinary. A production company, a management team, a familiar hierarchy of executives, assistants, and intermediaries. On paper, nothing seemed unusual. In practice, every major platform, Every gate of opportunity led back to the same invisible center. Different doors, the same room. What distinguished this network was not its size, but its reach. It did not dominate through force. It dominated through presence. Wherever decisions were made, it was already there. Quietly, patiently, waiting. For artists who understood the rules, this system could be generous. Careers accelerated. Visibility expanded. Doors opened that others never even saw. All it asked in return was alignment. Not loyalty, not devotion, just compliance. A willingness to stop asking certain questions. For those who did not understand the rules, or worse, refused to learn them, the experience was very different. Our subject began to sense this shift gradually. Invitations arrived, with conditions that were never written down. Meetings were held where meaning lived between sentences. Phrases like, "This is how things work," replaced explanations. When he pressed for clarity, the responses became vague. When he hesitated, the tone cooled. This was not punishment. It was calibration. The system did not need to break him. It only needed to position him correctly. We often imagine power as something aggressive, something that announces itself through domination. But the most effective forms of power operate through normalization. They convince you that resistance is unreasonable, that your discomfort is a personal failure rather than a structural design. Around him, others seemed to adapt effortlessly. Some even thrived. They learned when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned which rooms required compromise and which required nothing at all. Over time, success began to look less like talent and more like fluency in an unspoken language. He did not speak that language. Instead, he asked questions. Not confrontational ones, honest ones. Questions about creative direction, about boundaries, about expectations that seemed to shift without notice. Each question marked him, subtly, as difficult. Not dangerous, just inconvenient. In a system that values predictability, inconvenience is enough. The contracts that once appeared to offer stability began to feel different. Clauses restricted movement. Commitments extended indefinitely. Exit routes narrowed. Independence, once assumed, now required permission. From the outside, his career still existed. His name had not vanished. His image had not been erased. But momentum slowed. Projects stalled. Opportunities dissolved before reaching him. There was no announcement, no explanation. Only absence. This is how containment works. Not through elimination, but through limitation. The network did not isolate him physically. It isolated him professionally. Every attempt to move forward redirected him back into its orbit. Every effort to step away revealed how many invisible threads were attached. We must understand something here. This was not personal. Systems like this do not operate on emotion. They operate on efficiency. He was not being targeted because of who he was, but because of what he represented: unpredictability. Unpredictable people introduce risk. They cannot be relied upon to maintain equilibrium. And equilibrium is everything. As pressure mounted, the psychological toll became evident. Isolation breeds doubt. Doubt erodes conviction. He began to question his instincts, his decisions, his refusal to adapt. When everyone around you appears to move forward effortlessly, it becomes easy to believe that you are the problem. This is the most dangerous stage. When external control transforms into internal conflict. At night, he replayed conversations in his mind, wondered if he had misunderstood, if he had been too rigid, too idealistic. The system never told him he was wrong. It simply allowed silence to answer for it. Still, he did not yield. That choice, small as it seemed, had consequences. Because systems designed to manage outcomes do not tolerate unresolved variables for long. They adjust. They escalate. They bring closer those who were once distant. They ensure observation becomes constant. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space around him grew smaller. That was when he realized something terrifying. The system was not watching him. It was enclosing him. When pressure increases, systems rarely tighten all at once. They apply it selectively through proximity, through familiarity, through people who do not look like enforcers but function as them, all the same. The figures who moved closest to him were not strangers. They were classmates from years before. People who once shared classrooms, rehearsals, and private ambitions. Their presence felt reassuring at first. In moments of uncertainty, familiarity offers comfort. It suggests continuity. It suggests trust. That assumption would not survive for long. Officially, they were colleagues, managers, advisors, professionals tasked with guiding his career forward. Unofficially, their role was more ambiguous. They were always nearby, always informed. Conversations that were meant to be private found their way back into meetings he was not invited to attend. Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be. Every schedule adjustment required approval. Every creative choice invited commentary. Every deviation, no matter how minor, was quietly noted. When he asked for space, he was reminded of obligations. When he asked for clarity, he was told to be patient. The boundary between support and supervision blurred until it ceased to exist. This is the point at which isolation becomes complete. Not because no one is around, but because no one is truly on your side. The people closest to you serve two functions simultaneously. They reassure you while ensuring you do not stray too far. He began to feel watched, not in a paranoid sense, but in a procedural one, like a variable being monitored within acceptable limits. There was no hostility, only control. For someone who had built his life around expression, this was suffocating. His days became predictable, his movements traceable. Spontaneity vanished. Even leisure felt observed. The world around him narrowed to approved spaces and sanctioned interactions. He did not know where the rules were written, but he knew exactly when he had crossed them. At night, the silence was heavier than any confrontation. Silence leaves room for imagination, and imagination fills the gaps with fear. He replayed memories of the past, searching for the moment everything changed. He wondered whether trust had ever been real, or merely convenient. There is a particular cruelty in betrayal that arrives without malice. When those who confine you believe they are simply doing their job, resistance feels irrational. You begin to question your own reactions, your own discomfort. Perhaps this is how it is supposed to be, he thought. Perhaps I am the one who failed to adapt. He was not the first to face this realization. Across the industry, stories circulated quietly, never documented, never confirmed. Accounts of performers who were offered advancement in exchange for compliance, of others who refused and found themselves erased without explanation. Roles reassigned, projects canceled, names omitted, no threats, no ultimatums. just consequences. One actress described being asked to vacation with a client. The word was chosen carefully. Innocuous. Suggestive without being explicit. When she refused, the legal response was swift and disproportionate. Contracts weaponized. Financial penalties imposed. Freedom became something she had to purchase. Another spoke of a director who demanded payment, not in money but in presence. 7 days. 7 nights. The price of participation. She declined. Her scenes disappeared from the final cut. These stories rarely reached the public. They did not need to. Their purpose was internal. They reinforced the rules. They reminded everyone watching what resistance costs. Even those who tried to intervene learned quickly. A male actor once stepped between a powerful investor and a young performer at a private dinner. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply interrupted. By morning, the actress had been replaced. The message was clear. Within this context, his disappearance was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. At the height of his visibility, he began to fade. Interviews stopped. Announcements stalled. Years passed without explanation. From the outside, it appeared voluntary. A break. A hiatus. From the inside, it was something else entirely. He did not vanish because he wanted to. He vanished because there was nowhere left to stand. The system did not need to destroy him publicly. It allowed him to erode privately, to carry the weight alone, to wrestle with doubt until exhaustion replaced defiance. By the time questions began to surface, they came too late. The damage was already embedded. Opportunities lost cannot be restored. Trust once broken does not return unchanged. What remains afterward is silence. And silence is efficient. By the time people started asking questions, the damage had already been done. What happened to him was not an exception. It was a demonstration. Once his absence became noticeable, the explanations followed a familiar pattern. He needed rest. He was reevaluating his priorities. He had chosen to step away. Each version sounded reasonable. Each version protected the structure that required no scrutiny. In industries governed by silence, absence is always easier to explain than resistance. Behind closed doors, however, the narrative was already understood. Refusal in this world is not treated as a decision. It is treated as a disruption. And disruptions must be corrected. The correction rarely arrives in the form of confrontation. Instead, it comes as subtraction. Fewer calls, fewer invitations, fewer acknowledgments. The work does not stop entirely. It simply becomes smaller, slower, less visible, eventually irrelevant. We have to be precise here. This was not retaliation driven by anger. It was procedure. The same procedure applied to anyone who failed to align. Once identified, the response was predictable. Remove leverage. Remove momentum. Allow time to do the rest. Time is the most effective enforcer. Stories like his circulated quietly among performers. Not as warnings delivered openly, but as conclusions drawn privately. A glance exchanged. A sentence left unfinished. Everyone understood what had happened, even if no one said it out loud. One actress recalled how a promising role dissolved after she declined a private discussion framed as professional mentorship. No accusation followed. No argument ensued. The role simply went elsewhere. Her agent advised patience. Her peers advised silence. Another performer described being offered advancement in exchange for companionship. The proposal was never explicit. It did not need to be. When he refused, his calendar emptied. Months passed. Projects moved forward without him. Each account differed in detail, but the structure was identical. The system did not punish loudly. It taught efficiently. Within this environment, the choice to maintain boundaries carried a cost that extended far beyond a single opportunity. It altered reputations. It reshaped trajectories. It redefined futures. Those who complied advanced. Those who did not were remembered as difficult, or unstable, or uncommitted. Labels once applied are difficult to remove. For him, the consequences unfolded gradually. His disappearance was framed as a pause, but it functioned as an erasure. 3 years passed. No official statements. No public disputes. The silence itself became the message. Psychologically, this stage is the most destructive. When resistance yields no visible result, doubt fills the void. He began to question whether his principles had meaning in a system that did not reward them. Whether endurance was courage or stubbornness. Whether survival required compromise after all. The world around him moved on. New faces emerged. New narratives replaced old ones. The absence of explanation allowed the system to continue unchallenged. This is how patterns persist. Not through force, but through normalization. From the outside, observers often ask why people do not speak sooner, why they do not leave, why they endure. These questions assume choice where structure exists. Leaving requires alternatives. Speaking requires platforms. Both are controlled. What remains then is endurance. Quiet, isolating, and deeply personal. When fragments of his story began to surface, they did so indirectly. Online discussion, anonymous testimonies. Patterns recognized after repetition made coincidence impossible. People began to connect separate incidents, to see structure where they had once seen misfortune. The response was cautious at first, curiosity mixed with fear. But something shifted. Small acts accumulated, comments left, questions asked, symbols shared, none of them powerful alone. Together, they suggested something else. Attention. Attention is dangerous for systems built on obscurity. As scrutiny increased, minor irregularities emerged. A manager questioned. A partnership examined. A financial relationship quietly adjusted. These were not admissions. They were adjustments. The kind organizations make when visibility increases. From a distance, it appeared insignificant. But for those watching closely, it signaled the first fracture. Still, the cost had already been paid. His career did not return to what it had been. Lost years cannot be reclaimed. Opportunities denied do not reappear unchanged. Even when narratives shift, damage remains embedded in time. What endured was the question his story left behind. Not about guilt or innocence, but about design. About systems that function so smoothly they leave no trace of their own hand. And about how many others had passed through the same process without being noticed at all. By the time people started asking questions, the damage had already been done. In the aftermath, there was no single moment of reckoning. No dramatic confession. No decisive victory. Systems like this do not collapse all at once. They adjust. They endure. They wait for attention to fade. What followed his disappearance was not outrage, but persistence. Quiet gestures multiplied. Messages left where they could not be erased easily. Symbols repeated until coincidence no longer explained them. Individually, these acts meant very little. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Attention, once sustained, changes behavior. Small inquiries surfaced. A manager reassigned. A partnership quietly reviewed. An agreement amended without explanation. None of these actions acknowledged the harm that had already occurred. They did not need to. Their purpose was containment, not justice. But even containment leaves traces. For those watching closely, these adjustments confirmed what had long been suspected. The structure was real. Its mechanisms were deliberate. And while it remained powerful, it was not invulnerable. This is the uncomfortable truth. Systems depend on people forgetting. Power that relies on obscurity weakens when exposed to sustained light. Not because it fears judgment, but because visibility introduces friction. Friction disrupts efficiency. The public response never pretended to be heroic. There were no illusions of overturning an entire industry. Instead, there was resolve. A refusal to allow the story to disappear quietly. A recognition that remembering itself is an act of resistance. Someone once shared an image that captured this idea perfectly. Countless small hands lifting a single object. None of them strong alone. Together, sufficient. Critics often dismiss such efforts as symbolic, as ineffective. They ask what difference attention can make against structures designed to endure. The answer is not immediate change. It is accumulation. Change begins when patterns are named, when silence becomes visible, when questions persist longer than discomfort. His story remains unfinished. Not because the facts are unknown, but because their consequences continue to unfold. Careers altered, boundaries redrawn, choices made under pressure that cannot be undone. What remains is the question his experience forces us to confront. Not about him alone, but about the environments we accept as normal. About the cost of survival when compromise is framed as professionalism. About what we teach those who come next when silence is rewarded and integrity is penalized. If kindness is consistently punished, what values endure? There are no simple answers here. Only responsibilities. To remember. To ask. To notice patterns where they are designed to remain unseen. Because systems like this do not depend on cruelty alone. They depend on forgetting. And as long as people continue to remember, to connect fragments, to refuse erasure, even the most carefully constructed structures will begin to show strain. As long as questions persist, even the darkest frameworks eventually crack. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, stay with us. Because silence is exactly what systems like this rely on.